Hi boys and girls, in this video I will be finishing our book Summer of the Sea Serpent. If you are following along at home, we left off on chapter 11, which is on page 87. And if you remember, the last thing that we read yesterday, Jack and Annie had just encountered the giant sea serpent, and he kept giving them the riddle, what is the purpose of the sword? And they had to get it right, or they didn't know what was going to happen. And the last thing that happened was Jack yelled out, the purpose of the sword is not fighting, the purpose of the sword is peace. So now we're going to find out if he was correct. So on page 87, chapter 11 is called Sword and Rhyme. The sea serpent moved its head very close to Jack and Annie and hissed a long, whispery sss. The serpent's flicking tongue touched the sword for a moment, and Jack's heart nearly stopped. But then the serpent slowly pulled back its head and began to uncoil itself from around the rocky island. The monster kept uncoiling its great body until once again the wide ring surrounded the cove like a circle of green hills. Then the serpent's head sank beneath the water and with barely a ripple. It was impossible to tell where its body started and where it ended. Jack and Annie lowered the sword of light and laid back on the rock. Then they let out a huge sigh of relief and sat down next to the sword. Kathleen and Teddy poked their seal heads up from the calm waters. Bark, bark, they barked. Jack and Annie laughed. It's safe to come out now, Annie called. The seals hauled themselves onto the rocky island. Then they plopped on their sides. The sword helped us answer the ancient question, said Jack. They all looked at the sword of light. It glowed brightly, even though the sun had slipped below the horizon and the purple sky was fading into twilight. We still have to get it out of here before it's completely dark, said Annie. I know, said Jack, but how? Look at Merlin's rhyme, said Annie. Jack took the shell from his pocket and he read the last line of Merlin's rhyme. With rhyme and sword, your home is near. Jack looked up. That doesn't make sense, he said. Perhaps it does, said Teddy. Jack and Annie turned around. Teddy and Kathleen were standing behind them. Their sealskins had silently slipped off. They were human again. Perhaps it calls for a magical rhyme, said Teddy. And I am a magician, remember? Annie laughed. How could we forget, she said. Teddy grinned. I've gotten much better at my rhymes, he said. Just watch. He rubbed his hands together, then he carefully picked up the sword of light. He gripped its handle with both hands. He pointed the silver blade toward the treehouse on the distant sea cliff. Teddy took a deep breath, and then he shouted, "Oh, sword of light, now light the night!" Teddy paused. Jack grew worried. Teddy always had trouble finishing his rhymes, and even the ones he did finish never worked out the way they were supposed to. Kathleen stepped close to the young sorcerer. Say it again, she said softly. Teddy called out again, "Oh, sword of light, now light the night!" Kathleen finished the rhyme in a sulky language. Ma-e bree, sto-e bright! The sword began to vibrate in Teddy's hands. There was a roar and a blast of white light. Shimmering beams shot through the dark. The beams wiggled and waved, and they streamed together to make a glittering bridge. The bridge spanned the purple darkness of dusk. It stretched from the rocky island in the middle of the cove to the cliff above the coast. When Teddy lowered the sword, the bridge remained in the sky. Wow, whispered Annie. She turned to Kathleen. What did you say to finish the rhyme? Ma-e bree, sto-e bright, Kathleen told her. Make a bridge strong and bright. Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say, said Teddy. Indeed, said Kathleen, smiling. She took Teddy's hand, and then she turned to Jack and Annie. 'Tis a bright bridge to take you from my world back to yours. You mean we can walk on it? Said Annie. Try it, said Teddy. Oh, man, said Jack. He laughed nervously. Then he raised his foot and put it down on the light. It felt solid. He put his other foot on the light and took a step forward. The light felt as firm as a brick pathway. Annie stepped onto the light bridge beside Jack. It was wide enough for them to stand side by side. This is so cool, she whispered. Wait, do not forget this, said Teddy. He carefully handed Jack and Annie the sword of light. Together they gripped the handle of the sword. What about you guys? Asked Jack. I must return to my cave now, Kathleen said, or my sisters will begin to worry. And I will see Kathleen back home, said Teddy, and then return to the future in Camelot. After you stay for supper with me and my sisters, Kathleen reminded Teddy. Oh, said Jack. He wanted to have supper with the Selkies, too. He wanted to spend more time with Kathleen and Teddy, whatever they were doing. We better get going, Jack, said Annie. It's almost dark. Okay, said Jack. Goodbye for now, Kathleen said to them, and thank you. 'Tis amazing how you defeated the enemy. The sea serpent wasn't really our enemy, said Jack. He was just like the Spider Queen, said Annie. They both seemed really scary until we got to know them. Yeah, said Jack. When will we see you again? Annie asked Teddy and Kathleen. I'm sorry, will we see you again? Annie asked Teddy and Kathleen. Yes, I have a feeling we will both see each other soon, said the Selkie. We will find you when you least expect it, said Teddy with a grin. Now, my friends, you must go. Night comes quickly upon us. Farewell. Farewell, said Jack and Annie. They turned and started walking up the bright bridge. High above the water, the sword's light swung over the cove like a swaying lantern. The water below shimmered in sparkling ripples. Jack heard 2 splashes behind them. He stopped and listened. Go, 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 whispered Annie. Jack started walking again. He and Annie climbed higher and higher until they came to the end of the bright pathway. They stopped off the bridge onto the rocky cliff and over the coves. Clutching the handle of the sword, they looked back. The shining bridge shattered into a million pieces of golden light. Like the sparks of a firecracker, the glittering pieces rained down through the sky, and they quickly burned out. The cove below was dark and silent, except for the distant barking of seals. Chapter 12, The Isle of Avalon. Now what? Jack asked. Now, I thank you, a deep voice said. Merlin, cried Annie. Merlin stepped out of the shadows. He wore his red magician's cloak. His long white beard shined in the radiant glow of the sword. You brought the sword of light out of gloom just in time, he said, before nightfall on the summer solstice. Why did we have to get it on the summer solstice? Said Jack. 'Tis the day when the powers of Ice Wizard of Winter are the weakest, said Merlin. The Ice Wizard of Winter? Said Annie. Does the sword belong to him? Did we just steal it from him? No, said Merlin. Long ago the Ice Wizard stole the sword from the Lady of the Lake and brought it to his kingdom high above the North Sea. Merlin pointed to the snow-capped mountains beyond the rocky coast. The wizard soon discovered that the sword of light was useless to him, for the Lady of the Lake had placed a spell upon it that made it powerful only in the hands of worthy mortals. Still the wizard refused to part with it. He buried it at the bottom of the cove. The cove of the stormy coast, said Jack. Yes, said Merlin. Only recently did the seabirds tell me of the sword's whereabouts. I knew I needed worthy mortals to retrieve it, so I sent for you on the summer solstice, when the Ice Wizard could send no mighty storms to keep you from finding it. He could only throw the cloak of the old gray ghost over you. So the Ice Wizard sent the fog, said Annie. And did he put the sea monster in the cove too? Asked Jack. Merlin smiled. No, the serpent serves the Lady of the Lake. Long ago he secretly took it upon himself to find the sword and guard it. Should any mortal survive the wizard's storms and gales, they still had to prove themselves worthy by answering the servant's question. I believed you two would be able to answer the question wisely, and I was right. Your rhyme helped, said Jack. He and Annie carefully handed the sword of light to Merlin. Will you put the sword in the stone now? Asked Annie, so Arthur can pull it out someday and become king? No, this sword is even more powerful than the sword in the stone, said Merlin. This sword has a name, Excalibur. Excalibur, said Jack and Annie. I will take it back to the Isle of Avalon now, said Merlin, and return it to the Lady of the Lake. Some day after Arthur is king, she will give it to him. The sword will help him face many challenges bravely and wisely. Merlin was interrupted by a strange sound from the water below. It sounded like the deep bellow of a foghorn. What is that? Said Jack. Ah, yes. There is one last thing to do, said Merlin. He raised the sword and pointed it toward the cove of the stormy coast. Like the beam of a giant searchlight, the sword's light streamed over the black waters. Merlin moved the beam back and forth as if he were looking for something. Ah, he said, there it is. The light revealed a gigantic head of the sea serpent. Its yellow lamp-like eyes shined back at them. He mourns now, said Merlin, for he has lost his purpose for being here. 'Tis time we help him home to the waters of Avalon. The magician lifted the sword slightly. Then the beam made a path to show the monster the passage out of the cove. The giant serpent slid through the water and soon disappeared beneath the waves of the dark summer sea. His mission is done now, said Annie. Yes, and so is yours, my friend, said Merlin. You must climb the ladder to your treehouse and go home. By the light of the sword, Jack and Annie found their way to the rope ladder and climbed up into the treehouse. When they looked out the window, they saw Merlin standing in the glow of the sword light. Bye, Jack and Annie called. The magician raised his arms and spread his fingers in a wave of farewell. Merlin's gesture stirred something in Jack's memory, but he wasn't sure what it was. Let's go now, Annie said. Jack took the seashell out of his pocket. He pointed to the words Frog Creek. I wish we could go home, he said. Wait, said Annie. Our shoes! We left them on the beach. Too late. The wind started to blow. The treehouse started to spin. It spun faster and faster, and then everything was still. Absolutely still. Jack opened his eyes. A warm summer breeze wafted into the treehouse. The noon sun shined between the tree leaves. No time at all had passed in Frog Creek. Merlin was the water knight, said Jack. What? Said Annie. When he said goodbye, Merlin gave us the same wave that the water knight gave us, said Jack. Remember? Jack raised his hand and imitated Merlin's gesture. You're right, Annie laughed. Why didn't I think of that? He always helps us get started on our missions. And now we have 3 things from him, said Jack. He put the pale blue shell on the floor next to the royal invitation and the yellow autumn leaf. Then he looked at Annie. Home? He said. She nodded. They climbed down the rope ladder and started walking barefoot through the damp, leafy woods. I guess we'll just have to tell Mom we lost our shoes in the time before Camelot, said Jack. Yeah, said Annie, on our way to get the Sword of Light that was stolen from the ice wizard of winter and guarded by a giant sea serpent who served the Lady of the Lake. Right, said Jack. A simple explanation. You ready to go swimming at the lake now? Asked Annie. Jack remembered the thrill of being a seal and zooming through the deep waters. It won't be the same without Kathleen and Teddy, he said. We won't be seals. We can pretend, said Annie. Let's hurry before Mom decides it's too late to go. They took off running. They ran barefoot through the woods, over sticks and leaves, through the dappled noon light. Then they ran down their street. They were out of breath by the time they reached their yard. Oh, wow, said Annie. Look! And she pointed at their porch. Sitting on the front porch were their sneakers. Jack and Annie climbed the porch and picked up their shoes. Jack had turned his over. Fine white sand fell out and a couple of tiny silver pebbles. Who? How? He said. A seagull screeched overhead. They looked up. The gull screeched again and flew away and disappeared into the soft summer light. Annie shrugged. A little leftover magic, she said. Then she called through the screen door, Mom, we're ready. The end. Boys and girls, if you remember, just a couple pages back, when Merlin was talking about the ice wizard, let me see here, the Ice Wizard of Winter, book number 32 is actually about that ice wizard. So next week we will get to read more about him. I'll see you later. Bye.